Hi guys, welcome to my channel. Today I am going to tell you a scary story about my neighbor S-Kid who turned into a zombie after being bitten by a dog. The crazy thing is that nobody else realizes what has happened except me. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any new stories. I live in a suburban neighborhood where everyone knows each other. Mrs. Williams next door has two kids, 9-year-old Billy and 7-year-old Susie. They are the sweetest kids ever, and every time I see them, they say hello and ask how I am, and I always make sure to give them a few bucks for candy or ice cream. Overall, it's a quiet neighborhood. There isn't much excitement here. That is why it was such a shock for me when one afternoon I heard gunshots and screaming. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. Of course, I went to check what was going on and saw Mrs. Williams in her backyard with a shotgun in her hands. She looked wild-eyed and frantic. When she saw me looking at her, she screamed, "Get away from here," and fired 2 more warning shots in the air. Naturally, I did as I was told and backed away. What could I do? Mrs. Williams was obviously mad. I just hoped that everything would be okay. But the next day I noticed that the police had visited them and were talking to Mrs. Williams. Still, nobody knew what had happened, and Mrs. Williams was very secretive. She started closing all her curtains and wouldn't talk to anyone. Even her kids stopped coming over to play. About 2 weeks later, I noticed that Mrs. Williams was digging a hole in her garden. She wasn't alone. Her husband, Mr. Williams, was there too. He was home from business trips and seemed pretty disturbed by the situation as well. While he was digging, he kept yelling, "What have I done? What have I done?" I didn't hear his wife say anything. She just stood there silently, continuing to dig the hole. After they were done, they filled it back up and I didn't think much of it. I just assumed that they must have planned to put a new tree or something in the ground. However, that same night, at around 3 a.m. I heard screams again. I looked out my window and saw Mrs. Williams standing in her backyard, arms crossed, watching 2 men in white coats take her children away. I immediately called the police and told them to investigate, but they said that they couldn't intervene because both parents had signed the necessary papers allowing their kids to be taken away. At that point, I had no idea what was going on. All I knew was that those poor kids weren't lucky enough to have normal parents like mine. A month went by, and during that time, I only saw Mr. and Mrs. Williams twice. They left the house only to throw their garbage in the bin and quickly ran back inside, almost like they were ashamed for having been outside. One day, however, they decided to move out. A moving truck arrived and they took all their stuff out of the house. As soon as they were done, they got in their car and drove off. It was strange to see a family suddenly move out of a perfectly good home, especially without even saying goodbye to the neighbors. And even though it was strange, everyone went on with their lives and tried to forget about the Williams family. One evening, however, while I was sitting on my porch, I heard some footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw none other than Susie Williams. She looked different somehow. At first, I thought that maybe she had grown out of her old clothes. But then I realized that her skin was gray and she had these weird black markings on her face and neck. I wanted to call out to her, but she had already disappeared by that time. A few days later, I met a social worker who used to take care of Billy and Susie. I asked him if he knew what had happened to the Williams kids and what their parents had been hiding. "The kids are fine," the man said, giving me a weird look. "They are in good hands now." "What do you mean?" I asked, but the guy just walked away. I was weirded out. As days went by, I began to see Billy and Susie more often. At first it was just Susie, but a week later, I also saw Billy walking around. They both looked pale and skinny, but I didn't pay much attention to that. However, one day, I saw Susie playing with a group of kids from the neighborhood. She was older than them, so I was surprised to see that they were getting along well. Then I noticed that she didn't have a shadow, and I'm not talking about the time of the day or anything like that. I'm talking about the fact that she literally had no shadow. Of course, I thought that this had to be some kind of trick of the light, but when I looked closer, I realized that she didn't have a reflection either. After that day, I started noticing strange things about Billy. He didn't seem to age. One day he was 9, and the next day he was still 9. Also, whenever I gave him money, he would just stare at it as if he didn't know what it was. Sometimes I would see Billy drinking from a puddle or eating grass. Whenever I approached him, he would stop and stare at me for a moment and then run away. At this point, I had seen enough. I went to the authorities and told them about the kids, but they said that they had no jurisdiction over supernatural occurrences. They advised me to get help from a priest. However, when I went to see Father Williams, he refused to come with me. "The devil doesn't play with children," he said, shaking his head. "You need to let them go." But I couldn't let them go. Those poor kids were clearly suffering. so I decided to visit an old friend of mine, John. John and I used to work together in a paranormal investigation team until I quit because of personal problems. John was the best paranormal investigator I ever knew. Maybe he could help me. When I told him about my suspicions, he didn't hesitate for a second. "Let's go see those kids," he said, grabbing his equipment bag. We decided to pay Billy a visit first. We found him in his room, drawing pictures of the sun. John talked to him and asked him what his name was. "Billy," he said, pointing to a picture of himself. "How old are you?" John asked. Billy pointed to the sun and then to himself. It became clear to us that Billy believed he was the sun. We then went to Susie's room. She was standing in the corner growling and scratching at the walls. "Who's there?" I asked. Susie stopped and stared at me for a moment. There, she whispered, pointing at me. "He's there." And then she started growling again. It was clear that both kids had lost their minds. John and I talked to the kids for a few more hours, trying to figure out what had happened. Finally, we made them draw pictures to try and understand what was going on in their heads. Billy drew a picture of a big dog biting him. Then he drew a picture of his parents and a priest, all with halos around their heads. Susie's drawings were darker and scarier. They showed her being bitten by a dog and turning into a monster. That's when we figured out that they hadn't been bitten by just any dog. It had to be the devil dog. The legend says that the devil dog is a huge canine creature that comes out at night to feed on people as souls. Anyone who is bitten by it slowly loses their mind. Eventually, they turn into soulless monsters, and their life force starts draining away. At that moment, we understood why Mrs. Williams had shot at me. I must have accidentally entered their property right after the devil dog had bitten her kids. She thought I was the monster. Also, that explained why she and her husband had buried something in the garden. I'm pretty sure it was the dead devil dog. It was hard to say which of the two kids was in worse shape. Both of them needed urgent help. However, the sad truth is that there is no cure for the devil dog bite. The best you can hope for is that it slows down the process and helps preserve their humanity for longer. This is why I believe that Mrs. Williams sent her kids away. She knew they were doomed and didn't want them to suffer anymore. Unfortunately, even though their parents tried to protect them, the devil dog bite drove them insane. I'm really sorry for them. As for me, I can never forget those kids. If I ever see them again, I will gladly open my house doors and welcome them in. Maybe we can fight the darkness together. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this creepypasta, leave a like and subscribe. See you next time.